Welcome to Upticks with Jake Falcon, founder and CEO of Falcon Wealth Advisors. In this podcast, we help high net worth individuals overcome financial complexities. We do this by enhancing financial literacy and discussing topics in a language free from industry jargon. Join us as we help explain exactly what having a solid financial plan means, as Jake draws from years of experience in helping hundreds of individuals get financially organized and focused on their goals. We hope you find Upticks educational, entertaining, and shareable. Now, on to the show.
Welcome back to Upticks. This is episode 218, The Business of Wine with Doug Frost. All right, Doug, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Why, thank you, Cory. How's it going?
Everything is going great on our end. How are you doing?
Just fine, just traveling as usual.
And where are you traveling this week?
Well, I'm in New York today, but I'll be leaving for Singapore tomorrow.
Okay, very exciting. Well, good for you, Doug, and safe travels. I appreciate you carving out some time to come on the show Upticks here today. And
no
for
worries,
everyone
my pleasure.
Yeah, no, it's great, Doug. And for everyone who's watching and listening at home, Upticks is the show that we're recording here today, Doug. This is the show that Jake and I started together several years ago. For the last couple of years, we've kind of ventured off and we're both hosting our own shows independently. And now we've merged those once again back into Upticks. So for a lot of people, I'm sure watching and listening who are used to hearing Jake host this show, Jake and I are both going to be co-hosting the show. We'll both be continuing to bring guests on and, of course, recording weekly content for everyone. So that would be the change in the host, at least for today, for everyone watching and listening at home. But as far as today's guest goes, Doug, again, appreciate you being here. I know for many people who are likely watching or listening to the show, Doug is someone that needs no introduction. But for those of you that don't know Doug, Doug is a wine consultant, a writer, and one of only 4 people in the world to hold both the Master Sommelier and Master of Wine titles. And Doug's also the co-founder of Echolands Winery in Walla Walla, Washington. And Doug, we're excited to talk about the business of wine with you here today.
Wonderful, thank you.
And I think, Doug, it's been a few years, of course, since we've met. It has been great getting to know you and to draw from your knowledge. And I think for everyone watching and listening at home, the reason that I asked you to come on to the show here today, Doug, is just for that, for your knowledge and expertise. Many of the clients that we work with as a practice are baby boomers who are either already retired or approaching retirement. We know that baby boomers have driven the success in the wine industry over the last few decades and frankly represent a large demographic of wine consumers. So naturally, I do expect this show to be of interest for everyone. And what we'll talk about, of course, today, Doug, is the business of wine and, of course, the world that continues to change around us. But we're really excited to have you here today. Excited to keep the subject matter on the show diverse and venture into some different topics outside of 401k contributions and Roth IRA conversions and everything else that we talk about on the show week to week. So, Doug, let's just go ahead and get right into it. Can you first just tell us about your background and really your passion for wine, where it came from?
Well, I come out of the restaurant business. I was washing dishes at 14, so it's like I come out of it honest. And quickly figured out there was more money to be made out on the restaurant floor than there was in the back of the house. So I've worked in restaurants, but throughout my career, then I've worked in restaurants and hotels and consulted with airlines and cruise lines and on and on. I got really serious about wine about 35, 40 years ago and became interested enough to try to actually, make a career out of it and passed the Master Sommelier final exam, I should say, because it's a series of exams. But I passed the final exam in 91. And then I passed the final exam again. It's a series of exams for the Master of Wine in 93. And I have to say, it's always funny because people are like, oh my God, you were the second person in history to do both. I bet you had a lot of job opportunities. I was like, no, nobody even knew what the hell those things were back then. It was a different time. And so it probably partly explains why I still live in Kansas City. Although the real reason why I still live in Kansas City is because not too long after I passed those exams, I got a job offer in New York. and my kids were probably 3 years old and 1 year old at that point. And I said to my wife, they'll put us up in this hotel. It's a really cool gig. And she looked at me and she said, well, I think you should go. I was like, no, 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 no. See, they'll put us up in a hotel and, all of us, and we'll find a good place. And she said, no, I think you should go if that's what you want to do. I was like, no, 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 I'm good. I'm good right here. I'm great in Kansas City. Well, I love it here. It's great. Perfect.
Got to appreciate the spouse's way of making it clear.
Yes. Oh, it was very clear to me that we were going to remain in Kansas City, where we had some family and we had support and such. And the truth is, with my career, whether dealing with United Airlines, Chicago's a quick, flight from Kansas City, whether dealing with wineries in Washington or California or Oregon, that's, 2-3 hours away as well. Come to New York, 2-3 hours away. It's been pretty easy to live in Kansas City and do what I do.
Yeah, no, Doug, and I think it's great, and I think it's we're lucky to have you here in Kansas City, and glad that you, of course, are still continuing to travel and venture into the winemaking world the way that you are. And let's talk about that, Doug. The the business of wine. What is most relevant? What do you think when you think about the winemaking business more specifically? What is it that you think is most relevant, or that you'd want to really share with the people that are tuned in today?
Well, I think things are very, very much in flux. Of course, we live in the upside down world now, and it affects wine no less than any other industry. So I would add to that the pandemic, the dynamic of the pandemic has been, of course, as I think people famously have heard, people drank more during the pandemic. What they didn't do, though, was necessarily become more adventurous in what they were drinking. Typically, the people that benefited during the pandemic were the very large companies, and it probably surprises people to discover that in the United States, over 90% of all the wine that's purchased and consumed is made or imported by 13 companies. There are, at the same time, thousands and thousands of wineries in the United States who don't participate in that, or at least are shut out from that. So they do their business direct, and those who were well established when the pandemic struck did really well, and those who were not, that would include me and Echolands Winery, which started basically our first release of wine was May of 2020. Let me think. I wonder how things were at that point. But I had a great business plan because I have incredible connections in the restaurant business because of my past officership in the quartermaster sommeliers and my work and teaching through that. So I have incredible restaurant connections. So, again, May 2020, we're going to focus on restaurants. We're really, oh, wait, okay, yeah, that's not good either. So, essentially what has happened to the wine industry, I think our little example is a good example of what's going on and where we find ourselves today. More importantly, and believe it or not, there are more important, market effects than what the pandemic did to us. But more importantly, and even aside from the supply chain, because of course that's real, it was that the wine industry has been on a tear for 25 years, and that great wave is over. And so what is happening today is that wine consumption, which has steadily marched forward, began declining about 5 years ago or so. But that was okay because wine purchasing in terms of dollars spent continued to march forward until about 2 years ago. And it's not the pandemic. It was happening before the pandemic. And at least this, prognosticator believes that no, the great wave had crashed and it was done, and it was a great ride, and it's time for reality check. And a lot of that has to do with what people are drinking. Younger consumers are not necessarily focused on wine, as people know. They're often focused on beer, or they're often focused on cocktails or spirits. And I do a ton of work with the alcohol industry on the distillation side, on the education side for cocktails and bartending and bar managing and stuff like that as well. And so I get to participate in all that. And I think the truth of the matter is that there are just many more options than there ever have been before. And so wine, which benefited from a particular, allure, the viewpoint that it was the drink of the intelligentsia, it was the drink of people with culturation and with enough money to do so. It still exists, but it's just not as strong an impulse as it was if we go back 10 and 20 years ago.
And do you think, Doug, that's driven primarily by demographics or something else?
I think it's driven primarily by demographics, but I think it's also a matter of timing. Everything has its time, and wine was the benefit of being the cool and hip thing, which is to say, check back in 20 years, it'll be cool and hip again because everything old is new again at some point. But yeah, the younger generation often views certainly Napa Cab as a boomer product. Okay, boomer, drink all the Napa Cab you want to. I'm going to drink this really cool Pet Nat because, I don't drink what you drink, and I'm never going to drink what you drink. And if I were in the Napa Cab business, I'd be a little terrified right now because my consumers are dying off, and the number of people who are willing to part with $250 for a bottle of wine there are fewer of them than there used to be. And I think even more importantly, the diversity of the wine world is so robust that people recognize that unless you love that $250 bottle of wine, and go for it, it's cool. But unless you love that, there are a million other options. And you know what? They probably don't even cost $25.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But it does make a lot of sense. But I think the generational divide or the gap there and perception, right, is one thing. But secondly, just kind of going back to something that you said earlier, Doug, having a business plan, adjusting that business plan when circumstances change, that sounds like, admittedly, Doug, it sounds a lot like financial planning, right? What we do with clients, which is just that, setting up a plan and adjusting it as life happens and things change. And that does lead me to a question, though, going back to May of 2020, right? The time frame you highlighted earlier. What changes in the business plan took place as a consequence of the pandemic? Because obviously the focus on restaurants and a few other things changed.
Yeah, it really did. So certainly we had to reconsider what we were making, who we were planning to sell it to, under what circumstances. The hope had certainly been to focus largely on DTC, and it became apparent very quickly that it was like, no, we're going to have to enter the wholesale marketplace, which is going to cut into our margins significantly. As well, at that point in time, needless to say, wholesalers were not seeing anyone. As many people may know, a lot of the large wholesalers were in fact laying people off as quickly as they possibly could. Now, I won't vilify them in that, because the belief was at this point, and I was as much a believer of this as anybody, is that we were looking at an extinction event for, restaurants, bars, etc. And we certainly saw the loss of a number of restaurants and bars, but the kind of 50% extinction event that people like me thought was going to happen didn't happen. People found a way to muddle through, whether it was with the parkettes out in the middle of the street, or doing delivery, or letting people do pickup. However people got through, they got through, and so the wholesalers, the really large wholesalers, find themselves in the position right now of having to rehire people who now no longer want to come back, or if they did, they don't want to come back and work for the jackasses that fired them, especially when those said jackasses made money hand over fist because people continued to drink, and suddenly they didn't have a sales force to worry about. They were just filling orders, and so it's a funny thing, and it worked out really well for them. So who's the dummy now? So what's going on right now? I think is that our business plan had to, like everybody said, the famous verb pivot was all that we did, and now we're kind of we find ourselves in a different situation where we're selling a lot of wine to a lot of wholesalers in a lot of different markets, but now I'm finally able to get back out on the road and talk to people in restaurants who buy for restaurants and start to make things happen there. Far more importantly, Washington State, as people may remember, was really the first place the pandemic went crazy. And so it was shut down like mad. And so it took us until January of this year, January 22, before we actually got to open a tasting room. And now it's about how can we generate traffic through the tasting room, which then generates traffic to the wine club, which generates, DTC traffic, et cetera, et cetera. So, we really, in many ways, just had to put the skids on and slow the program down.
No, that makes sense. The pivot, right, is what everybody has done the last few years, exactly like you said. And, that the industry that you're in, the wine business, right, was no exception. And I think that just kind of leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you about, Doug, which is just the supply and demand. You mentioned supply chain challenges earlier. I'm just curious, how does everything that's materialized the last few years, where did you really feel the impact of that the most?
Yeah, the effect of supply chain issues has really hit us across the board. We've been fortunate in that labor has not been the biggest issue up until today. Literally, over the last 2 months, labor in the winery has become an issue, which I have to admit, most of us really didn't see coming. We thought we had this dialed in. Labor in the vineyard was what we were told was going to be really, really difficult. And because we work with, I would say, smart and can I even say kind and compassionate vineyard management people, we haven't had a problem in the labor force. Certainly things were difficult and challenged through the pandemic. But when it comes to just materials themselves, yeah, supply chain has been real. Get in line for bottles, get in line for corks, get in line for labels and label printing. It's been oftentimes, well, I certainly can remember in the midst of the pandemic, when we were getting ready to bottle the 2020s, I had to buy corks 5 times because I'd buy corks from one person, they'd say no problem, and then they'd get back a week later and say, nah, they're not going to show up for another year. It's like, what? So I just kept buying and buying and buying until we actually got what we wanted. And so I feel like we surfed it pretty well. But famously, particularly bottles have been an issue. We had to switch bottles, we had to switch corks suppliers, as I say, we had to switch label printers, and in places like Champagne, where they really have a particular bottle that they're supposed to use, the entire world is dealing with a champagne shortage because of bottles. They can't get the right bottles and they can't get them there, and they've been dealing with that since the pandemic began.
Yeah, that's really interesting, but it makes a lot of sense. It's just I wouldn't have thought about it that way, but that does make perfect sense, particularly around a champagne shortage, thanks to that one unique bottle that everybody's having trouble getting their hands on. Doug, do people approach you? I'm curious, do people approach you often about investment opportunities in the wine business? And if so, what do you tell them?
Well, the queries around investment in wine usually are, I guess I would say, probably anecdotal, or it's somebody saying, I want to invest in a wine cellar. And so maybe the famous example of that would be that I've been in the wine business forever. So the 1982 Mouton, which today is a legendary wine, and I have a magnum of that. I'm not bragging. It's just that I was a wholesaler. I was a wholesaler in the early 80s. So when the 1982 Bordeaux wines hit the market, I was selling them, and I thought, maybe I'll buy a few bottles and just, put them down. So that 1982 Mouton Magnum, it probably would go if I decided to sell it, which I'm never going to do because, I didn't pay this much money for it. $8,000, $10,000. Wow. I paid $80 for it. 80 is what I paid for it. And that was how little wine cost back then. And so people read about that and they think, oh my God, that's an incredible investment opportunity. It's also reflective of a completely different time and place. Things were cheap back then. I could actually afford to buy wines like Domaine de la Romanée-Conti because I might need to part with $100 or $150. These days, if I want to buy that wine, I have to part for a single bottle, sometimes as much as $15,000.
Wow.
That wine is never going to accrue in value in the same significant way it has over the last 30 or 40 years. So we're really in a different time and place. That said, of course, there's clever buyers and clever people who will figure out how to buy wines that today are not that expensive and that in 10 or 20 years will become so. But it's not the robust market that it was. So, where does one make wine and money in the wine business? Well, there is the old line that the only way to make a small fortune in the wine business is to begin with a large one. And I can say, as a winery and vineyard owner, I am right on schedule. We are getting the job done. We are slowly carving out a small fortune out of a large one. And so, the investment opportunities really are long term. It's a long scale that you have to look towards. When it comes to vineyards, I see at least that as being one of those opportunities. But again, it's going to take to purchase and plant a vineyard will take you a minimum of 5 years before you will get your first crop. You will spend anywhere between $20,000 an acre to $100,000 an acre, assuming you don't do something stupid like try to buy a Napa Valley. But you'll spend 20 to 100 grand just purchasing the land, hopefully at the lower end of that. And then to actually plant it and wait until that 5th year, you're going to probably be in all total something between $80,000 and $100,000 an acre. From that land, if you're lucky, you might find a way, depending again on where you are, you might gross about $20,000 to $30,000 a year gross. And so you can see that the scale that you're dealing with when it comes to vineyards is very long. You need to be willing to be there for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And then hopefully the value of that land, the value of that vineyard, that the demonstrable quality that comes from there is such that the land is worth significantly more. And the vineyard, I should say, the wine that you get off that land is worth significantly more.
Yep, that's really good, Doug. Thank you. And I think, I just can't help myself, Doug, in pointing out some of the similarities between obviously the business of winemaking and the business of investing, more broadly speaking, that we talk about with clients. It sounds to me like some of the same things that we talk with clients about, Doug, are relevant in your business, which is it's critical to have patience, to maintain discipline, got to deal with variables that are outside of your control. And also the value compounds over time, right? Some of the bottles that you just mentioned earlier, the same thing can be relevant in the world of investing. The value can ultimately compound over time, but it requires some patience and discipline and dealing with the variables that are outside of your control.
Yeah, I think discipline is a really key word in all that. You have to understand what business you're in and be smart throughout it, because the variables will come at you from every side. And anybody who's invested in anything over the last 3 to 5 years, they don't need me to tell them that. They know that. It's really, really obvious that you got to be fast. You got to be really nimble.
No, that's really good though. But I do love that some of the same parallels are drawn there. So Doug, I've got 2 more questions for you. The first one is, can we answer once and for all the validity of health benefits associated with wine consumption? Because I have heard contradictory statements about this for the last several years, and I don't know a better expert to ask on the subject matter than yourself.
Right. Well, talking about health and any food product is fraught with fraught with uncertainty, if not controversy. And alcohol, I think, absolutely tops the list of all the ingredients that we may found delicious, like fat and sugar and salt and all those ingredients that we're told, yeah, but stop consuming those will kill you. Well, you got to have some fat, you got to have some salt, and on and on and on. So when it comes to alcohol, I think first and foremost, it's useful to understand that it is a drug, and like all drugs, a little bit might be good for you, but a whole lot of it is not good for you. So it's dose specific, and everybody's dose is different. So it's really confusing to people who want to have a very simple answer, because there are no simple answers when it comes to alcohol. Humankind has evolved to consume alcohol. Our bodies create alcohol, which we then break down into various substances. So it is not as though alcohol is alien to us, but I certainly understand somebody who says, no, I don't drink alcohol at all. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I understand that, but I don't want to live in that world. I like the emotional benefits of alcohol consumption, particularly the emotional benefits of alcohol consumption with my friends and family. There is no question that even a glass of wine at dinner, when we're all together, just brightens the conversation. Human beings, like I said, have evolved with this stuff, and we have always found ways to make it, and always found ways to utilize it, often in not just medicinal ways, but often in religious or cultural ways. I mean, alcohol has always been used as a cultural artifact, if not a religious artifact. So it's a funny thing. I mean, I'm not giving you a very clear answer to what are the health benefits, when what we really want to hear, of course, is if you will have only one glass of wine a day, if you're a woman, only have 2/3 of a glass of wine a day, you will live 5 years longer. I mean, we want a prescription like that, and no such information really exists, in frankness. We want to hear that resveratrol and red wines is going to help us, in this way, whereas we also hear that alcohol will increase your chances of breast cancer by a certain amount. So it really comes down to the fact that, or at least what I view, that moderate consumption of alcohol is probably not very damaging to you. It is possible that it damages some people, but I have no doubt in my mind at all that moderate consumption of alcohol makes my life easier and better and friendlier and more fun. And I'm sorry, you'll never get it, pry it out of my cold dead hands.
Got it. No, that's good, Doug. Good answer. I know it's maybe kind of a tough one, but that is a good answer, and I appreciate that perspective. What I hear you saying is, like anything, everything in moderation, but it's going to vary, and it's going to be different from person to person. Okay, good. So last question I have then, Doug, is what is it that Midwestern wine drinkers need to know? A lot of the people watching and listening to this show.
Well, yeah, I do want people in the Midwest to understand that excellent wine is made everywhere, including in the Midwest. One of my favorite things to do is drag, let's say, one of the dessert wines we make in the Midwest to some faraway place, whether it is that I'm dragging it to London or San Francisco or Singapore, wherever, and pour it blind for people. Now, the people listening will have heard me say a dessert wine, which is to say that I think our greatest wines are sweet wines. I'm not saying that only sweet wines are made in the Midwest. I would say instead that I think some of the greatest sweet wines that are made in the United States are made in the Midwest, more so, frankly, than what I see on the coasts quite frequently. So for me, I think that people should understand that excellent wine is being made here in the Midwest. The difference is, I will allow this, that with exceptions, most of the wines made in the Midwest are not keepers. Drink them when they're young, whether the sweet stuff or the dry stuff. And increasingly, people in the Midwest, winemakers in the Midwest, are getting very skillful at making dry versions of their wines that are really delicious. Again, don't hang on to them for 3 to 5 years. Drink them when you buy them. But it is true that the grapes that we use are in the Midwest are often so tart that people found it necessary to make a sweet version so that it tasted good to most people. So the irony is, when people go, oh, all Midwestern wines are sweet, I'm like, no, actually, they're so damn tart that it was hard to make a dry wine that people would buy, because you actually want sweetness in your damn wine. Yep. At least you want fruitiness. So we're getting much better at it now. And I think there's excellent wines made in the Midwest, whether dry, off dry, sweet, or dessert.
Very good. Well, we heard it here first, Doug. Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. I appreciate everybody, of course, at home who is watching and listening. Doug, is there anything else that you have to add here today?
No, I would just say people should always remember that we like a lot of different foods, and we're okay with that. Don't let somebody tell you you're supposed to like a particular wine. Like what your body tells you tastes good, and that's what you drink.
That's really good. That's good advice, because it's going to be different for everyone. And oftentimes some of the uniform answers that we're looking for just don't exist. Kind of back to even the health piece that we talked about earlier. The reality is it's going to be different for everyone. But that's good advice. Stick with what your body tells you, just like you said, and it's okay. You don't need someone to tell you what you should and shouldn't like, frankly. So again, Doug, I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show here. I certainly wish you, safe travels to Singapore, and I understand you're headed there very soon. But for everybody watching and listening, thanks for tuning in. Make sure that you are subscribed to the Falcon Wealth Advisors Collective and Upticks, so you get new notifications when episodes just like the one we're recording here today are released. And Doug, we'll look forward to the future of both Echolands Winery and hearing about your travels and adventures moving forward. And I'm sure the audience will enjoy following along. If somebody wanted to get a hold of you, Doug, or wanted to kind of follow along, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, certainly echolandswinery.com is our website. You can sign up for the newsletter there. And we try to keep people apprised of all the craziness that is winemaking through that newsletter and through the website.
Excellent. Again, Doug, thank you. Thanks for everybody watching, listening at home. We'll look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you for listening to Upticks. Click the subscribe button to be notified when new episodes become available. Also, be sure to visit our website, falconwealthadvisors.com, and click the Contact Us button if you'd like to meet with Jake and his team.